In 1918, Jake Collier, a lean 23-year-old cowboy, stepped off his weathered horse and onto the town's only dirt road, his boots kicking up clouds of fine dust. His face was chiseled, roughened by years of sun and hardship, but his eyes held a quiet intensity, a man who had seen too much loss to ever forget. Jake's life had been a struggle since his father, George Hawk, passed away years ago. The storm that had wiped out their cattle had also claimed the land that had been in the family for generations. With the bank at their door and no one to turn to, George had died alone, a victim of despair and bad luck. Jake had buried him in the same plot where their cattle now lay in graves, and since then the weight of survival had been on his shoulders. He worked the ranch jobs that others couldn't or wouldn't do, mending fences, breaking wild horses, and hauling water through the unforgiving desert heat. Every day felt like the same, just the endless cycle of hard labor and empty nights. He had no family left, no friends who could change his situation. Just him and the silence of the bluffs. But that day something was different. A rider approached from the horizon, a silhouette against the pale sky. As the rider drew nearer, Jake's unease grew. There was something in the way the man carried himself, something that spoke of wealth and authority, far removed from the dust of Coyote Bluffs. The rider stopped before Jake, handing him a cream-colored envelope, the faint scent of lavender wafting up as it brushed his fingers. "Looks like you've been summoned," the rider muttered, his voice low and flat. Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the distance, leaving Jake standing there, staring at the mysterious letter. The faintest chill ran down his spine. He opened it slowly, as if the very paper might hold a secret far darker than the quiet town around him. Jake's fingers trembled as he unfolded the letter, its fine paper almost too delicate for a man who had spent his days working rough, calloused hands. The words written inside were simple but commanding, written in an elegant script that seemed out of place in a town like Coyote Bluffs. "Jake Collier, you are invited to join me for supper at Blackthorn Ranch. The hour is late, but the invitation stands. There is much we can discuss. Eleanor Blackthorn." He stared at the name Blackthorn Ranch, a place that he had only heard of in rumors. The ranch was known as a place of wealth and mystery, run by a woman who kept to herself, shrouded in secrecy. The name Eleanor Blackthorn was no less mysterious, a woman whose reputation was as sharp and cold as the iron gates that surrounded her estate. People spoke of her with both awe and fear, yet few had ever seen her face, much less stepped foot on her land. Jake stood in silence, the letter now heavy in his hand. The smell of lavender lingered in the air, oddly calming, almost hypnotic. Why him? He had no wealth, no connections, and nothing of value to offer someone like her. His life had been reduced to surviving in the dust of this town, not dining in the lavish halls of a ranch that could be straight out of a different world. The wind picked up, tugging at his coat as though urging him forward. Maybe it was curiosity or perhaps the silent promise of something greater, but Jake knew this was an opportunity, one that might lead to answers he never thought he'd find. With a final glance at the faded town behind him, he mounted his horse, determination in his eyes. The invitation had been made and now he would follow. Jake rode through the barren plains, the distant silhouette of Blackthorn Ranch finally coming into view. The iron gates stood like a sentry, towering and unwelcoming, adorned with a gleaming rattlesnake crest that glinted in the fading light of day. The heavy gates creaked open as Jake approached, revealing a long, winding path flanked by tall, looming trees that seemed to bend inward, as if guarding the secrets hidden behind the mansion's stone walls. The house itself was grand, an imposing structure that looked out of place amidst the emptiness of the surrounding desert. It stood as if it had been pulled from another time, the sharp angles and towering spires giving it a cold, almost menacing aura. Jake's horse's hooves clacked against the stone driveway as he rode closer, the silence of the place pressing against him like a thick fog. The front door opened slowly and a manservant stepped out to greet him. His face was expressionless as though he'd seen it all before. Without a word, he motioned for Jake to follow him inside. The grand hall was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of antique wood and something faintly metallic. Confederate portraits hung on the walls, their eyes seemingly following Jake as he passed by. The servants, silent and efficient, moved like shadows in the background, their faces hidden beneath dark, starched uniforms. At the far end of the dining hall sat Vivian Blackthorne, the woman of the house. Her presence was immediately striking, an almost ethereal beauty hidden behind a veil of coldness and mystery. She didn't stand to greet him. Instead, she waited at the grand dining table, her posture stiff, her eyes watching him closely, as if she was measuring him in a way that made Jake feel more like an object than a guest. For a moment, Jake hesitated, but the weight of the invitation and the mysterious air of the place urged him forward. He took a seat at the opposite end of the table, unsure of what this strange dinner would bring. The silence in the dining hall was thick, broken only by the clink of silverware as a servant placed a fine-cut steak in front of Jake. Vivian Blackthorne sat across from him, her eyes unwavering as if studying every move he made. The meal before them was an opulent display, expensive cuts of meat, fresh bread, and fruit that didn't belong to a place like this. The elegance of the room and the food only deepened the unease that settled in Jake's gut. Vivian had barely touched her meal, her fingers delicately tracing the edge of her glass, the thin veil of her dress swirling slightly in the air. She finally spoke, her voice low and measured, but with an edge that sent a chill through Jake. "I've watched you, Jake Collier," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "Watched you struggle, watched you toil in that sun-scorched town. You don't belong there. You have potential. If you know how to use it." Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair, not sure where this was going. The woman before him was as cold as the mansion that surrounded them, and her words felt like the beginning of something far more complicated than he could imagine. "You are a man of means," she continued, her voice dropping, becoming almost a whisper. "But you are also a man of little consequence. I can change that. I have an offer for you, a business arrangement if you will." Jake's brow furrowed as she slid a small piece of paper across the table, its edge glinting in the dim light. "I propose a marriage," she said bluntly, the words hanging in the air between them. "A union for 1 week. At the end of it we part ways, no strings attached. But in that week, I'll ensure you have all the wealth and status you could ever dream of." Jake stared at her, the absurdity of her proposal leaving him momentarily speechless. A marriage, business or not, with someone like her? It seemed impossible. "Why me?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse. Vivian's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Because you are poor, decent and forgettable," she said, her eyes flashing with something he couldn't quite read. "And that is exactly what I need." The air was still, the first light of dawn creeping over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The world was quiet, as though holding its breath for what was about to unfold. Jake stood in front of a small, weathered chapel on the Blackthorn Ranch grounds, the ground beneath him damp from the early morning dew. His boots scuffed the earth as he shifted uneasily, his gaze never leaving the figure before him. Reverend Owen Pierce, the whiskey-scented preacher, stood to the side, his eyes dark and shadowed, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched the Bible. There was no joy in this ceremony, no warmth, just a cold, mechanical inevitability to the whole affair. Vivian Blackthorne stood beside Jake, her eyes fixed ahead, her lips pressed into a tight line. Her veil fluttered slightly in the breeze, but her expression remained as stone-faced as ever. There was no music, no festive air. The only sound was the distant rustle of leaves and the occasional clink of the preacher's glasses as he cleared his throat. His voice echoed strangely in the still morning air as he began the ceremony, his words ritualistic and hollow. "I now pronounce you man and wife," he said, his voice lacking any of the passion or reverence one might expect at a wedding. Vivian gave no indication that she even heard him. There was no kiss, no glance of affection, just a cold formality that marked the moment. Vivian's vow, when it came, was as empty as her gaze. "I suppose I must," she whispered, her words barely audible in the quiet morning. It wasn't a declaration of love or even of duty, it was a statement of resignation, as though this was something she had been forced to endure. Jake felt the weight of the moment settle over him like a heavy cloak. This wasn't a marriage, it was a transaction, a deal made in the shadows. But something gnawed at him, a flicker of doubt, a sense that this cold union was only the beginning of something far darker. The days at Blackthorn Ranch blurred together, each one eerily similar to the last. Jake had expected the luxury to bring him comfort, but instead, it felt like a gilded cage. The mansion, grand and imposing, seemed to hum with a cold, unsettling energy. Inside, everything was polished to perfection: silk sheets, fine china, and meals that could have fed a king. Yet, despite the opulence, Jake felt like a ghost in a house full of shadows. Vivian barely acknowledged him. She retreated into her locked room each night, her footsteps echoing down the long corridors, leaving Jake to wander the vast halls in solitude. The servants moved in silence, their expressions masked, as if they were all part of some strange, unspoken ritual. At times, Jake could hear the faint whispers of their conversations, but when he approached they would fall silent, their faces hard and unreadable. Louis Klein, the stable master, was the only one who spoke to Jake with any regularity. He warned him with quiet urgency, his voice low as he leaned in close. "Curiosity will get you killed here, son," he said one afternoon as Jake passed him near the stables. "The last man who asked too many questions. Well, let's just say he sleeps under roses now." The words lingered in Jake's mind long after they were spoken, and for the first time he felt a cold shiver creep down his spine. Something wasn't right about Blackthorn Ranch, but the answers remained just out of reach. Each day Jake felt more trapped, more isolated, as if the walls of the mansion were closing in around him. And then there were the nights. When Vivian's door was locked and the servants had all retired to their corners, Jake would stand by the window, staring out into the night. The ranch was still, but he could feel something lurking in the shadows, something that had been there long before his arrival. The day was unusually hot, the sun beating down relentlessly as Jake wandered through the sprawling halls of Blackthorn Ranch. He had grown restless, his curiosity gnawing at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. Vivian had locked herself away again, and the house felt more empty than ever. The servants were all busy with their duties, leaving him with nothing but the oppressive silence. It was in one of the upstairs rooms that Jake found it. A small door, half hidden behind a heavy tapestry, beckoned him with its air of mystery. His heart raced as he approached it, his fingers brushing the cool brass of the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit study filled with books, maps, and strange trinkets. It felt like a room that hadn't been disturbed in years. In the far corner of the room, a desk sat covered in papers. Among the clutter, Jake's eyes were drawn to a leather-bound journal, its pages worn and yellowed with age. His hand shook as he picked it up, the faint scent of lavender still lingering on the pages. He flipped it open, the ink a faded black, but the words were still legible. "I was never meant to be loved. Only remembered," the first entry read. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The words struck him with a coldness, as though they were meant for someone else, someone trapped in a story he couldn't yet understand. He continued reading, his eyes scanning the pages quickly. 7 days left, another entry read. "I will make him see. But it will not be enough." The chilling words reverberated in his mind as the weight of the journal's significance settled on his shoulders. Vivian had known something was coming. She had been preparing for it all along, and Jake, it seemed, was a part of her plan. But what was the plan? What was she hiding? As he closed the journal and tucked it under his arm, a cold dread filled him. He wasn't just a pawn, he was part of something far darker than he could have ever imagined. The ranch was unnervingly quiet when Jake awoke. The usual sounds, the rustle of servants moving through the halls, the distant lowing of cattle, were missing. The stillness pressed against him, heavy and unnatural. He had felt it since the night before, an unsettling calm that hung in the air like the calm before a storm. As he walked through the corridors, his boots echoing too loudly in the silence, Jake realized the house felt different. There were no servants to be seen, no workers moving about the grounds. He found himself at the locked door to Vivian's study, the one that had been her sanctuary, where he had found the journal just days before. The door was ajar now, an invitation to step into the unknown. With a quick glance over his shoulder, Jake stepped inside, the musty smell of old leather and dust filling his lungs. The room was dim, but there was a strange, eerie light filtering through the cracks in the heavy curtains, casting shadows on the walls. His gaze fell immediately to the desk. The journal was gone, replaced by something even more chilling, a trunk, old and heavy, its brass locks tarnished by time. With trembling hands, Jake approached and opened it. Inside, wrapped in yellowed cloth, were papers, letters, documents, a small child's photograph and a will. The name at the top of the will sent a shock through his body. Jake Collier. His name was scrawled in ink, left everything to him. But there was no mention of Vivian. No mention of anything except an inheritance tied to the house, the land. And a secret he wasn't sure he wanted to uncover. The final letter lay on top, its words scrawled in Vivian's unmistakable handwriting. I needed a witness. I am disappearing. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he stood frozen, the weight of the revelation settling over him. The ranch, the strange marriage, the chilling warning from Louis Klein, it all made sense now. Vivian hadn't married him for wealth or status. She had needed him for something far darker, far more personal. And now, with her gone, he was left to piece together the truth of what Blackthorn Ranch had always been. The wind howled across the canyon, carrying with it the scent of dust and earth. Jake's heart raced as he urged his horse forward, the sharp cliffs and jagged rocks of the canyon rising on either side. He had spent hours riding, driven by a force he couldn't explain, until he finally reached the place, the willow tree that had appeared so vividly in his dreams. There, beneath the gnarled branches of the ancient tree, Vivian lay. Her body was still, her once imposing figure now small and fragile, her face pale and drawn. The faintest trace of a smile played across her lips, as though she had found peace in the very place where she had once been a prisoner. Jake dismounted, his hands shaking as he knelt beside her. Her breath was shallow, a soft rasp in her chest as she fought for each breath. The air around them seemed thick, as though the world itself had stopped moving in reverence to this moment. I owe you peace, Vivian whispered, her voice barely audible, yet somehow clear in the stillness of the canyon. Her hand reached out, finding Jake's as if seeking some final connection. Jake's chest tightened, the weight of her words crashing over him like a wave. What happened, Vivian? He asked, his voice raw with a mix of anger and sorrow. What is all this? Her eyes fluttered open, and for the first time, Jake saw vulnerability in them. I never wanted this, she whispered, her eyes searching his as if seeing him for the first time. But I had no choice. I had to disappear. There was no other way. As her voice faltered, Jake held her, his hands trembling as he supported her fragile form. The air around them seemed to hold its breath as she exhaled, her body going limp in his arms. With one final, ragged breath, Vivian Blackthorn passed away, her spirit carried away on the wind as if the land itself had claimed her. Jake sat there for a long moment, the weight of her death settling heavily upon him. He had never known her, not truly, but in that moment he understood. He understood the cost of the secrets she had kept, the price she had paid for freedom. And now, in the silence of the canyon, he was left to carry the burden of her legacy. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the vast expanse of Blackthorn Ranch. The wind had changed, no longer carrying the weight of secrets and whispers but a new sense of possibility. Jake Collier stood at the edge of the land that had once belonged to Vivian Blackthorn, now his inheritance, a place that had seen both despair and triumph. He had buried her beneath the willow tree in the canyon, her final resting place now marked by a simple stone, engraved with her name and the words, "Freedom through sacrifice." It was all he could offer her, an acknowledgement of her pain and the price she had paid for the choices she'd made. Jake had transformed the ranch since that day. He paid the workers fairly, treating them with respect that had been lacking under Vivian's rule. The land, once darkened by secrets, began to heal. He had started building a schoolhouse in her name, something Vivian would never have done, an effort to give back to those who had been forgotten. Orphans from nearby towns were taught to read and ride, their laughter now filling the air, replacing the eerie silence that had once hung over the place. Jake watched them, a small smile tugging at his lips as the children worked with the horses, their faces filled with the joy of simple things. Each evening, as the sky darkened and the stars began to emerge, Jake would make his way back to the canyon. There, by Vivian's grave, he would sit in quiet conversation with her spirit. He never asked for answers, never demanded to know the secrets she had kept. But somehow, in the stillness of the canyon, he knew that he had finally found the peace she had sought, and the peace he had never imagined he would find in this life.